Hello everybody, and welcome to Students for Political Engagement. So today we're talking to Carmine Perrelli, who is a regional and local councillor who is running for mayor. So good evening, Mr. Perrelli.
Good evening. How are you guys?
I'm doing good, doing good. So to start us off, would you like to give, a short self-introduction and some of the things you think you've accomplished on city council over the years?
Absolutely. Thank you. I started in politics in 2010 as the Ward 2 councillor. I ran for mayor in 2014. I didn't win. In 2018, I ran for regional and local councillor, and I did. One of the first things that, the residents told me back in 2010 was that snow plowing was a big issue in Richmond Hill. And then when the plow went down the street, it left this big wall of snow blocking your driveway. It's called windrow. So I vowed to the residents, I gave my word that I would do everything I can to bring in a service that cleans that at the end of the road. Twice I went to a knocking on a door during a campaign, and I was told a heartbreaking story of how two people died. They got a heart attack trying to clean that windrow. And that's just a sad situation. It's not necessary. So I fought for many, many years for the residents. And finally, in this term, in 2019, we implemented the windrow snow clearing service that cities like Vaughan and Toronto and Markham already had. And despite what some people say, that the haters out there, they'll say that it costs so much money, $4.5 million. Well, that's not true. It's about $380,000 a year to do all of the houses, all of the driveways for the entire winter season. So that's one of my proudest things that I've accomplished. And there's a whole list of others as well.
Okay, cool. So our first question is actually about our public parks and green spaces. So how will you work together as mayor to protect and improve the environment of Richmond Hill?
Okay, that's a very good question. So let me tell you, instead of what I'm going to do, because those are called campaign promises and they're not worth much. Let me tell you what I've actually done. So in my first term as a Ward 2 councillor, there was a big piece of land, 189 acres, known as the David Dunlap Observatory. And I moved a motion to protect that entire space as a central park for Richmond Hill. 189 acres where the David Dunlap Observatory is. Now, if you drive by there today, you'll see along Bayview, it's a complete wall of buildings, of townhouses. It's not very, very nice to look at. And because the council didn't have the same vision as I did, now it's lost forever. It can never be a park. In this term of council, I asked staff and council to approve to speak to a company called BAIF Developments, because they have a large parcel of land on the southeast corner of Yonge and Bloomington. Again, it's slated for development. I want to protect it forever. Again, a central park, not ideal. It's on the north end of the city, but it'd make a nice gateway into Richmond Hill, and we could do all kinds of stuff with that. So I've already done it, and I plan on continuing in that fashion.
Thank you. And our next question, I guess, is sort of encompassing more the safety aspect of Richmond Hill. So an important part of a livable community, apart from green spaces, is of course community safety. So how would you, as mayor, and how did you as councillor, maintain and improve community safety in Richmond Hill?
So, safety is becoming more and more of a concern in the community. And there really is only one way to protect the residents of Richmond Hill, and that's for all of us to be vigilant. In other words, we need to explain to the residents that if they see something, they need to report it. But once they report it, we need to give the police the resources to stop a small issue from becoming a huge problem. You've got to nip it in the bud, as they say, right? Before it starts to grow and fester. We have some of those areas, sadly, already in Richmond Hill. They're mostly in the downtown core, the village core. A lot of it has to do with, sadly, we have a wonderful organization called 360 Kids, where homeless youth can go. It's a shelter for homeless youth, and it's very much needed in our community. The problem is that when a homeless youth shows up on a Friday night, let's say, looking for shelter, and there's no room in the shelter, they don't end up going back to where they came from. They end up now sleeping homeless in Richmond Hill. And so how do you deal with that? Because, you know, for every action, there's a consequence. So we need to implement more services so that the police can deal with them properly before they become a huge problem.
So just to clarify, your solution, you're saying, to homeless children that do not have space in shelters would be to get the police. What would then happen once the police were there?
So if, for example, there's an encampment right now in one of the parks, and there was one on a private property, the police need to go there and explain to them that this is not legal. They need to help them find shelter. They need to connect them with Housing York Inc. They need to help them get to a shelter where there is room. We have to have those services, because if we don't, and we leave them to their own, what are they going to do? They need to survive. They need to live somewhere. So we need to help to get them there. Now, it doesn't have to be the police, but the police are already trained in that, right? They're trained to deal with mental health issues, with homelessness issues. And so they're probably the best to do it, but we need to give them the resources to do it.
So would you then also, as mayor, support perhaps the easier access to housing or residence, or perhaps creating more shelter spaces for these youth if there isn't enough space in the currently available facilities?
So I've discovered that we have the space. What we don't have is a method for them to understand how to get there. So that's the real issue. But yes, I would support creating additional spaces for them as they're needed. But a lot of it has to do with mental health. So sometimes, and you've probably heard this before, there's people that are homeless, there's room in the shelter, but they won't go. And there's a reason why they won't go. And it's twofold. It's either because they're afraid of how the shelters are run, for their own safety being inside. They actually feel safer on the outside, or the fact that they suffer from mental health and they just don't want to go inside at all because they have a mental health issue. And we need to deal with that. And for that, you need doctors. And so, you know, you have to, sometimes when people are a danger to themselves, the police have to step in. And there's a form in the Police Act that I forget what they call it, but I think it's called a Form 1, where the police can have you admitted to a hospital for a psychiatric assessment for 24 hours. And then from there, the doctor can assess whether you need to be kept against your will, against your will. And when I say this, I want you to understand how very important this is. My father is 85 years old, and he was suffering from some mental health issues. And he was doing some very things that were harmful to himself, not to the community, but to himself. And the only time he got the help was when the police intervened. They brought him to the hospital. They got him assessed. They forced him to go. We couldn't get him to go, but the police forced him to go. And today, he's back to normal. He's on the right medication, and he's enjoying his life that otherwise was very dangerous before. So I've experienced it firsthand. That's the kind of treatment we need, right?
All right, thank you. And I think going on another aspect of community safety, which is crime in the community. So do you have any ideas as mayor to address those sorts of issues?
Again, So the two things there, when I first became a councillor in 2010, I joined a committee called Road Watch. And what they do is they look out for cars in the neighborhood that are speeding and traffic and stuff like that. And then there's all kinds of other programs where you can join Neighborhood Watch, for example, where neighbors look out for neighbors, because the truth of the matter is the police cannot be everywhere at all times. It's just not possible. We're not a police state. We're not going to put the military on every corner. But two things have to happen. The community needs to watch out for each other. So start a program for that and educate people on how to do that. And number two, make sure that the police resources are there, either A, to implement those programs, or B, to make sure that they're responsive when something does happen. And they feel, residents need to know that the police are there to help.
So, obviously you say that the police can't be everywhere at once, and that's a very reasonable statement to make. So, when discussing things such as the mental health aspect of policing, and also the direct crime area of policing, do you believe that maybe the police are a bit overextended and a different sort of group of city or regional workers could help deal with perhaps mental health crisis separate from the police? Or do you believe that it is actually in the best interest for the police to deal with all of this?
Well, that's, you guys are asking really, really good questions. The reality is that there's been a lot of talk about, are there different people that are more suited to deal with mental health issues and not the police? The reality is that usually when there's an issue, somebody's suffering from a mental health issue, there's an illegal aspect associated to what they're doing. And it may not be criminal, but for example, my father was riding his scooter in the middle of the road. And, you need to be able, the police need to be able to pull up behind him, have the proper lights to stop him and pull him over. And you need to have the authority to do that kind of stuff. A psychologist, for example, or a person trained in behavior assessment doesn't have the authority to pull somebody over. So if anything, it has to be initiated by the police in conjunction with the other organizations, right? The mental health experts and professionals. So you don't have to always take them to a hospital, but if they don't willingly want to get help, then you have to have somebody available. So I'll give you another example. I saw a homeless lady once in Richmond Hill, and I pulled over and I introduced myself, and we had a wonderful, pleasant conversation. And I found out that she was Italian like myself, and she used to love having bacon and eggs in the morning, and she missed that. So I said, you know what, I'll see you tomorrow morning and I'm going to bring you bacon and eggs, right? So I showed up around 9 o'clock. I knew where she hung out, and I brought bacon and eggs. I didn't make them. I got them from a restaurant, right? And when I pulled up, she started yelling at me, calling me the devil. So the day before, we had a pleasant conversation, and today she completely flipped on me. And her legs were exposed, and she had sores that were open wounds. And I tried to get her help. So what did I do? I didn't call the police. I called the Salvation Army. And I said, could you come and help? And they did. They came, they sat with her, and they spoke with her, and they tried to get her help. And today she's still homeless because she won't go. So I think we need to go, when someone, you can't get through to them and talk to them, then I think you have to force them to help themselves. And you have to, bring them into the hospital, get them properly assessed, and help them, because that's what's necessary.
Thank you for that answer. And as you've previously mentioned resources, as a municipality, the financial health of the city is an important part of its operation. What will you do as mayor to ensure that Richmond Hill is on good financial grounds, while still at the same time providing the same or improved services?
Now, you guys have been looking at my platform because you're asking me all the questions that are already on it. So that's one of the number one issue in this campaign. So if you go to my website, you'll see, and you look at my big signs on the boulevards and the little ones, they all say 3-year 0% tax freeze with no cut in services guarantee. That's a guarantee, the next 3 years. And you say, well, why should we believe you? Why do we believe that you're going to freeze taxes when inflation is so high right now? When city staff are saying to members of council that we need to raise taxes 7 or 8%. Now, you know, you live at home with your families, and you know that families are struggling today. The price of gas, the price of food, everything is sky high, right? I don't want the residents of Richmond Hill to have to choose between paying their property taxes and putting food on the table. To me, that's unconscionable. So don't believe what I'm saying I'm going to do. Believe in my resume. And let me give you an example. In 2019, the library came to council and asked for an $800,000 a year increase to their budget. It represented 8% increase. Now, at the time, inflation was about 2%. So a 2% increase would be in line with inflationary pressures, but 8% was not reasonable. And so the current mayor, David West, he was a councillor at the time, he immediately said, well, if that's what they need, let's give it to them. I, on the other hand, questioned it along with some of my colleagues, Councillor Munch, Councillor Barrows. And we said, no, you'll have to find a way to run the library without cutting services, without raising more than 2%. And they came back 2 weeks later and said, we can't do it. If we don't get an $800,000 a year increase, we're going to have to start cutting services. That was the threat. So you know what I did? Instead of saying, okay, you can have your money, I was worried about your parents' taxes going up. I didn't want that to happen. I didn't see the need for it to happen. So we took over the library board. I went on the board, Councillor Barrows, Councillor DePaula, Councillor Munch, along with some other residents. And we did a quick analysis of what was going on. And you know what we discovered? We discovered that the accounting department, the library had its own accounting department, and it didn't need it. So we absorbed, the city of Richmond Hill absorbed the accounting function from the library without having to add any extra staff. And instead of, when the chairman came back for the budget, he didn't ask for $800,000 increase. He asked for an $800,000 reduction, lower. So a reduction in taxes, in budget. So that means we saved, since 2019 till now, we saved $1.6 million. Had we not done that, all the taxpayers in Richmond Hill would have paid $1.6 million extra per year for 4 years. Those of you good in math know that that comes out to $6.4 million. That's a lot of money, right? Now, what am I going to do as your mayor? Well, I'm going to do the exact same thing in every other department. We're going to find efficiencies just like that. And by the way, we didn't cut any services. As a matter of fact, at the library, we opened up all libraries that weren't open on Sundays before, and now all libraries are open on Sundays. So we increased the services, reduced the budget, and everybody's happy. So we're going to do that same thing with all of the other departments. And so that's the only way we're going to keep the taxes from going up for the next 3 years. Guarantee. And when I say guarantee, you know what that means? That means if I don't deliver, I'll resign. If I can't deliver that, I don't deserve to be there. I will resign. That's my guarantee.
All right, thank you for that answer. And I think going off to that, the other part of that guarantee, which is no cuts to services. So you said you would try and, find efficiencies in departments to allow for zero tax increases. So how would you like find those efficiencies in those departments while still making sure that those departments can do the same work that they did before and not result in any reductions to services?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So the reason I know it's possible is because as a businessman my whole life, I understand what it takes to run a business. And I understand when it comes to a budget that if inflationary pressures, I hope you understand what I'm saying when I say inflationary pressures, right? When everything goes up 2%, then your expenses go up 2%, then you need more money. You need to raise revenues by 2%. And usually that's offset by tax revenue. And so a 2% increase when inflation is 2% is reasonable. But from 2006 till around 2019, so 12, 13 years, every year, I fought against it when I was on council, but every year taxes went up by twice the rate of inflation. So instead of 2%, it was 4. Instead of 2.5, it was 5. So that on an average, they went up twice the rate of inflation over that period of 12, 13 years. Why? That tells me that there's waste in the system because it wasn't necessary. If you're efficient in what you're doing, you can run a business within the inflationary pressures. So now, really, I'm not going to be a hero by freezing taxes for 3 years because there's already more than that in waste. All I have to do is reverse that and not raise the taxes. Really, you should be asking me, Carmine, why don't you reduce taxes if there's that much waste? That's also a goal, to reduce the taxes. So it's going to be very easy. Now, how do you do that? Well, it's simple. When you do an analysis like we did of the library, you will find out very quickly where that extra money is going. And it's usually not going, sadly, to resources to pay for something. It's being wasted. And so when you cut the waste out and you make the budget nice and lean, you'll be able to. And we've done it. In the first year of this term of council, we only raised taxes 0.7%. 0.7, less than 1. And inflation was around 2%. The last 2 years, 0%. And you know what we introduced? Windrow snow clearing. That the capital investment was about $4 million. And the operating budget every year is about $380,000 to $400,000 a year. So we increased services and didn't raise taxes. And that's when I was just a regional councillor. As the mayor, I'll have additional powers, right? So I'll be able to do even more. And that's why I'm very confident. I don't want to lose my job when I become mayor, right? I want to be able to continue. So I'm going to deliver what I promised. And if you look at my record, I promised windrow snow clearing, I did it. I promised low tax increases, and I did it. I promised that during the campaign, I would replace blue and green bins, and I did it. So look at the history and not the promises. But when the two meld together, then you know it's real.
All right, thank you. And I think another aspect of what you mentioned is like services. So you mentioned like some additional services you added over the years. So looking towards the future, do you think there are any other additional services you might want the city to provide?
I think you guys are reading from my brochure, aren't you? Anyways, good question. So I guess my number one goal is to make sure that residents of Richmond Hill have a good quality of life. And what does a good quality of life mean? Well, it means that you listen to what people ask for and what they want and what they need, and you give it to them. So in 2010, we did what's called a park study and a recreation study and a cultural study. And we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to go out for companies to go out into the community and say, what is it you're looking for? What do you want? What do you want to see in Richmond Hill? Remember, I work for you guys, right? So the culture, recreation, and parks plan said, here's how many soccer fields we need right now. Right now. This is how many we have, and this is how many we need, right? So there, we needed more. And they did that with all kinds of sports. Pickleball, have you heard of pickleball? Right. So pickleball is a growing sport amongst older people like me, right? Soccer is, probably #1 sport in the world right now. Tennis and hockey. And so when I looked at that way back in the day, there was a need for another soccer bubble. And the current council with the current mayor, God rest his soul, Dave Barrow sadly passed away. But, they didn't want to do things quickly. They always wanted to do more and more studies and kick the can down the road, as it were. And I said, no, we need it now. If the kids need a soccer bubble now, we need to do it now. And we did. And it was fantastic. And it's at Richmond Green. For anybody who plays soccer knows it's there. So right now, there's a big gap between what's needed and what's available, right? The Richmond Hill Soccer Club, for example, has 7,000 kids enrolled. And there's not enough fields. That practices and games are having to take place outside of Richmond Hill. So it tells us there's a need there. We have approximately, I'm going to guess because I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but roughly around $30 million in the Recreation Reserve Fund. That money is there to build more soccer fields, to build more pickleball. And so two things are required, and you're going to hear this for the first time because I've never said it publicly. You need two things. You need the will and you need the skill. I possess both. I have the will to want to do it, and I have the skill from years and years of being in business and having to meet budgets because I didn't have the ability to just say, hey, everybody pay more taxes. I had to justify any increase and make sure supply and demand was met. So if you apply those same principles here, those are the kinds of services that are easy to implement once you have the will and the skill. But the #1 is the will. You have to have the will. So I have the will. I'm going to implement all of those services to make sure that everybody has a good quality of life. It's not just about saving money. It's about providing those services. Now, the money is already sitting in an account. All we have to do is spend it wisely, and we'll be good to go.
Now, I'm just going to backtrack very quickly. You mentioned how you've brought many services to Richmond Hill while still reducing the budget. But one of the things you mentioned was, of course, the bins, which is a bit controversial in Richmond Hill because it seemed that you weren't able to pay for that with city funds, and some information got muddled there. So just if you wanted to clarify what exactly happened from your perspective with those bins.
Well, it's really a political game that was played by my opponents. So what happened is, I'll give you the quick synopsis real quick so you understand. When I realized that I was getting a lot of calls from residents that they wanted to exchange their green and blue bins because they were damaged, and I wanted them to participate because I do care about the environment. They told me that the city was closed during the pandemic and they couldn't get it replaced. And a lot of them didn't want to go and buy new bins. And so I said, look, I'll provide a service. I'll have an event and I'll make it safe outdoors. You won't have to leave your car. We'll take the old bins out. We'll give you the new bins, and I'm going to pay for it because at the time, there was a small fee, like about $7. And I had raised at the time about $55,000, more than enough to pay for the bins. So that was the first thing I said. I'm going to pay for it, right? And I'm going to replace the bins as part of my giving back to the community. when my opponents on council, David West, Joe DiPaolo, heard that I was doing this, they asked for staff to bring a policy forward to try and stop my event from taking place. They were going to put restrictions in to stop my event. So I fought so that I could do this event. And at the end of it all, what they did, council exempted my event from the policy. Now, that meant that I didn't have to pay for any of the services for this event. When they realized the success of the event, and they didn't like the fact that I was getting, accolades for it, they tried in October, they moved a motion that that's not what they meant. What they meant was that I had to pay for it. I was just allowed to do it. But that's not what they said. So they moved the motion, and that's what you're all referring to, is that I owe $140,000 for the blue and green bin Enviro Day event. So
Sorry, but it does seem like you voted against the motion to remove the bin exchange fee in November of 2020, and then brought forward your own motion a year later in September of 2021. Would you care to maybe explain why you voted against the earlier motion to remove the bin fees?
yes. So when the motion came forward that we should put a fee in, staff asked us to put in a fee. And what they told us was that it was the residents that were damaging the bins, and therefore we should make them pay for the exchange fee. And at the time, given the information that we had, I agreed with that. What I found out between that vote and the other motion was that, in fact, it's not the residents damaging the bins. By admission, Miller Waste, who does our waste collection, said, Carmine, we damaged the bins, but not by being malicious, by doing our job. And I said, what do you mean by that? Well, in the winter is when most of the damage takes place, because you put your recycling out, snow gets inside, creates ice, freezes up your recyclables. How do we get them out? We're not going to root around with our hands and hurt ourselves potentially. So what they do is they bang the bin on the side of the truck to loosen the contents inside. And that's perfectly reasonable. So over time, those bins will break. They're not made out of steel. They're made out of plastic. That's why they're cheap, right? So when we heard that, and there was an outcry from the residents, we changed the policy. It's really that simple.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Right, yes, thank you. And going on to something that you mentioned, which is like your opponents on city council. So I know a lot has been made of like the conflicts between you and them, and various litigations that are going on. So do you have anything to say on that? And if that might in any way affect your performance as mayor if you were elected?
Excellent question. So last night we had the mayoral debate put on by the Richmond Hill Board of Trade. And that was a very hot topic. So let me explain so that you guys understand exactly what happened. So there's three things that they call lawsuits that I've initiated against the city. And the first two are really not the traditional word of a lawsuit. They're what's called a notice of application. What I'm basically saying is to a judge, what the council passed as a motion, a resolution, I believe was wrong. I believe it was illegal. And I want you, Mr. Judge, right, very learned judge, to tell me, were they right to do what they did, or were they wrong to do what they did? So the first one is on the $140,000 they say I owe for the bin. So just so you know, I begged my council colleagues not to pass that motion. I said, because if you do, you will leave me no choice but to challenge it in court. and they did it just the same. A complaint was made under the code of conduct, right, about this 140,000, and the integrity commissioner ruled that I was exempt from the policy and that I did not owe the money. Then the council, we tried to get them to repeal the decision, and they went and got a legal opinion from an external law firm. They paid tens of thousands of dollars for this opinion. And the opinion was, and I think you see it online in some places, that the judge will find that the council acted illegally and in bad faith, and that they will have to pay all of my legal costs. That's the summary. So the last council meeting, Councillor Barros tried to add to the agenda one last opportunity for the mayor and the other members of council to reverse their decision, in effect nullifying the two lawsuits, what we call the notice of application, to avoid wasting taxpayers' money. In other words, follow the lawyer's recommendation and do the right thing. And what they did was they tried everything they could to keep it off of the agenda. And when that was going bad, they even called the police into the meeting. So those two are what we call notice of application to quash the bylaw. And their own legal advice was, don't do it. You're wrong. So all they have to do is reverse their decision, because I'm not going to pay $140,000 that I don't owe. I mean, I have to have the right to be able to defend myself, and I'm doing it in the most efficient way I possibly can. The other lawsuit is not against the city. It's against the city because everybody named in the lawsuit works for the city. It's against 6 members of council and certain staff members who I'm alleging violated my rights. Now, one of the things they did, remember I told you earlier about the $55,000 that I raised to pay for those bins that they eventually exempted me from? That money is still sitting in an account. They've frozen it. Had they even taken that money to pay for the 140,000, I'd only owe 85. But they wouldn't take it so that they could keep the narrative out there that I owe 140. It sounds more powerful than 85,000. The other thing they did was, if you read the statement of claim, they took away my purchasing card. Wrongly so, illegally. They trespassed one of my staff so he couldn't come to the city. They did all kinds of things. I can't even remember the list of things. Oh, the worst offense of all was that for over a year, the city manager told all staff they were not permitted to speak with me. Imagine trying to do your job. I mean, you kids are great at texting and emailing and all that, but imagine if you couldn't talk to your friends on the phone. How that conversation would take place just in text, how long it would take to get your message across. And they took that right away from me. And what they did, what was really shameful, guys, is that when you tell staff you can't talk to Councillor Perrelli, they're put in a really bad place, because they figure, if I don't talk to Councillor Perrelli, he's going to be mad at me. If I do, I'm going to get fired. So it really put them in an awful position. So, you know, I asked them again, please, I begged them. And when I say beg, I actually said, I'm begging you, please don't violate my rights this way. Don't make me have to take you to court. And they said no. They continued to do it. They supported the staff recommendations to take away my rights, and they left me absolutely no choice. But the people responsible is not the taxpayers of Richmond Hill. It will be the 6 members of council that I'll be seeking compensation from, and the staff members, not the city. The city is named what we call vicariously, because all of those people worked for the city. And I don't want them to say, oh, we work for the city, we're protected. right? So now it's up to the residents of Richmond Hill to say, okay, do we believe Councillor Perrelli? Will the judge side with Councillor Perrelli? And just so you know, young ladies and gentlemen, in 2014, they did the exact same thing. They illegally passed a motion. Judge Sutherland, I'm happy to send you the judge's ruling. Judge Sutherland ruled that what they did when they withheld $5,400 from my severance was illegal and in bad faith. They appealed the decision, cost the taxpayers more money, and on appeal, the judge still said they acted illegally and in bad faith. And we finally settled, and I cannot tell you how much we settled for because that's what I agreed to do. But they were already found once guilty of acting illegally and in bad faith. And now I'm alleging that they're doing it again. So this isn't about Carmine Perrelli wanting to get rich. This is about Carmine Perrelli, who have begged them not to do these things. They wouldn't listen. And it's them that created this whole scenario, not me. Not me. I'm only trying to defend my rights. I hope that explains it for you.
Yeah, and do you think the troubled relations with the members of the city councilors will affect your ability to get policy passed as mayor?
Sorry, what was the question again?
Do you think your troubled relations with members of city council will affect your ability to get policy passed as mayor?
It's always difficult. Yeah, how do I explain this? You've heard the term, this council is dysfunctional. You've heard that term before? I see nodding. Okay. I want to ask you a question. Do you know where there's no dysfunction in government? I'm going to tell you. Cuba, China, North Korea, Russia, Iran, and I'm sure there might be some more. You never hear dysfunction because they're dictatorships. What they're really calling dysfunction on council is democracy. It's where people are free to say what they mean and stand behind it, where they're not afraid. Because when a council or a government is all in line, you gotta be suspicious. How is it that they're all agree? You know, if 1, 2, 3, 4 of you decide to go out for dinner tonight, it's going to be hard for all of you to agree to the same place. Some like sushi, some like Italian, some like Indian food. It's hard to agree, but that's what makes a democracy. So the majority will rule the day. So the reality is that, look, the truth of the matter is, if I wanted to be reelected and have a higher probability of being reelected, I would have stayed as a regional councillor, right? But there's a lot changing in municipal government. Premier Ford has told the municipalities that he's introducing what's called a strong mayor's system. And he's doing a test pilot project with Toronto and Ottawa. And later on, he said if it works, he's going to do it with any municipality over 100,000 people. And what that does is it's going to be aligned more with the US system of municipal politics, where they have a strong mayoral system. In other words, the mayor makes all of the decisions. And in order to overrule the mayor, you need 2/3 of council. And that's what he's going to start to do. And it makes sense. You know why? If I'm giving you all these campaign promises, then I should make the decisions. And if I violate those promises, now you can throw me out. But if I make those promises and I don't have the power, in other words, I only have one voice out of the 9, well, you can't really hold me responsible because the other, majority didn't want to agree with my vision. So if you're going to give me the power, give me the responsibility, then you can hold me accountable. And so what I believe is that in my heart, I believe that this debate is healthy. And you know, when they say dysfunction, did you know, young ladies and gentlemen, that over 80% of all of council motions pass unanimously? Unanimously, that's everybody agreed. And there's 20% that weren't unanimous. And that's a healthy democracy. The other stuff, you guys are young, you're very bright. You know a lot more than you pretend to know, but you're very bright, but you don't understand yet because you don't have the experience of the inner political rivalries and the strategies, right? Because the truth be known, David West is really desperate to keep the narrative out there that I owe $140,000. That's why he's violated the rules. He's acted illegally and in bad faith to keep that narrative out there till after the election. And you watch, after the election, it'll all be resolved. They'll repeal the decision, the lawsuits will be gone, and everything will be fine. But until then, hey, let's make Carmine look bad. And you know what? They're doing a pretty good job of it. It's really hard to explain, right? So, but to answer your question, yes, I'm going to be able to work with everybody because we've been doing it, even though we've been dysfunctional, as they say. That's a healthy democracy.
Cool. So just on a lighter note, and as you have previously mentioned, the Ontario government's legislation for the strong new mayor. So would you support similar powers here in Richmond Hill, just to clarify?
I would go, yes, I would go a little bit further. I'm of the belief that we have to see, excuse me, the strong mayor's system that Doug Ford is trying to implement has terms and conditions associated with it. It's all only to do with the growth plan that he's established. It doesn't give the mayor the complete powers as in the United States system. What I think should happen is we should adopt the US system. The mayor makes all the decisions.
Do you believe that this would maybe go against your belief in having a healthy democracy with more debate? If the mayor has a final say, the councillors' debate may not actually be important there.
Well, no, the mayor doesn't have the final say. The mayor has the first say. And so now you know. You see, if you look at our system now and you talk about, pick an issue. Should we have another bubble over a soccer field at Richmond Green? We had this debate. And we really don't know where David West sits on the issue, because when you look at the vote, he's just one of 9. So what was his vision? We don't know. If he had a strong mayor's position, he would have said, no, I don't want to do it right away. I want to study. I want to implement it over the next 3 or 4 years and do more studies. Now we could hold him accountable. We could say, Mr. Mayor, you voted this way. You made that decision. So if it's egregious enough, 2/3 of council can overrule the mayor. Because if the mayor is the head of council, he is the chief executive officer of the corporation. He has all kinds of different powers that I as a councillor don't have. Then he should be held to account. And he should make the decisions. And we, as residents of Richmond Hill, should be able to say, you made those decisions, you have to be held accountable. The way it works now is somebody else moves motions, he just puts up his hand one way or the other. What is his real vision? If you go to his website today and you look, I want you to find all of the concrete things he's going to do. I said 0%, 3 years. No increase. That's a concrete action. You won't find that in his platform. So yes, the mayor is going to make the decision. Everybody's going to know what that decision is. And if it's a crazy decision, of course, 2/3 are going to overrule him. And so it is still a healthy democracy, but it's a more accountable democracy, because now you know exactly what he did and what the council did. Because the way it is now, David West could have been on the right side of things one time, on the wrong side of things. You'd have to go motion by motion by motion, right? And it's hard to keep track, and how do you hold them accountable? So the mayor, if he is truly the leader of council, if he is the CEO of the corporation, and if you've already bestowed upon him powers like he decides what goes on the agenda, he decides who to hire in certain cases, he has discretionary budgets, and he has a relationship with the senior staff that I don't have. So he has all of these advantages. He should make the decisions. And I want to be held accountable. I want people to know that was my vision. And if I made the right decision, I want the credit. And if I made the wrong decision, then I want to be held accountable.
All right. And going on a lighter note about some other policies, an important part of a good city is efficient transportation. So what, as mayor, would you do to develop and improve Richmond Hill's current transportation system?
So sadly, I've been fighting this since 2010. So my family and I built a house on Garden Avenue in 1978. So I've been here a very, very long time. And I used to play hockey on Yonge Street when I was a kid, right between cars coming up and down. That was Yonge Street. So, and there were all farms up here where I live now. Probably where you live, there was a farm. And I've always said to myself, you know, what is the most efficient way of moving people? And the answer has always been, in North America, is a subway. And so I was very perplexed growing up that for 50 years, we hadn't advanced any new subways in Richmond Hill. And some of you will know that there's a city in China, and I forget the name of it, Shenzhen or Jinjin, something like that. I don't know what it is. But 20 years ago, they had a population of 8,000. And today it's something like 20 million. And why? How did they do that? Well, they built, I think in 20 years, 60 miles of subway. Amazing. Now, why is it that one country can do it and this country can't? Well, the answer is simple. In a dictatorship, one person makes the rule. And if he decides to do it, it's done. Well, in this country, people fight back and forth, healthy democracy, yes. But now you don't know what anybody's vision is. So the truth of the matter is that what you see down Yonge Street in certain parts of Richmond Hill, and then again up in Newmarket, is not the most efficient way to move people. I'm grateful that the province has seen the light, and now they've, given funding for the subway to come to Yonge and Highway 7. But it's woefully inadequate even when it comes to Yonge and Highway 7. Today, I believe that the subway should already be in Newmarket because the population warrants it. And then we can move people efficiently. But stopping at red light after red light after red light does not move residents quickly. And things become more affordable. When you talk about affordable housing, if a builder doesn't have to build all those floors of underground parking, the costs come down. If people don't have to buy cars, life becomes more affordable. You don't have to pay insurance, gas, repairs, and all of those things. You can just hop on a subway. One of my favorite cities in the world is Manhattan in New York, because you just walk out the door, go a couple of blocks in either direction, you're on a subway. In 20 minutes, you're at the end of the city, one way or the other. And it's efficient transportation. That's what we really need to do if we're thinking 100 years from now. Look, I'm not going to be here in 20 or 30 years. You guys will be all adults with your own family by then. But I'm thinking for 100 years down the road or more. And we really need to advance that subway system, not the bus lanes in Richmond Hill and Newmarket. I'm sorry. That's not going to be an efficient way of moving people.
Well, yes, thank you for that answer. And I think some other aspects of transportation that don't involve like mass moving people include things like walking and cycling. So do you have any ideas on how those areas of transportation might be developed?
Okay, so that's a very difficult situation in North America. You know, if you're in Florida, for example, it's very easy to build, you know, bike lanes because they're utilized all year round. And it's different in North America. There's so many other factors to consider. But one of the things Councillor Munch has always been fighting for is a more walkable community, more pedestrian friendly. So Councillor Munch goes around now with a scooter all summer, an electric scooter. And he's actually canvassing today, every day on his scooter. So is his team. And it's really nice to see. So we need to try and encourage that. Now, where can you ride your scooters and bicycles? Well, right now, technically, it's not legal to ride them on subways. But I find it very difficult. Sorry, was that?
Sidewalks.
So what did I say?
Subway.
Oh, subway, sorry. I said the wrong word. My son corrected me. It's not legal to ride on sidewalks. I was thinking subways from the previous story. It's not legal to ride them on sidewalks. So, you know, I don't think it's right that bicycles and these scooters, electric scooters, should be on the road. You know, if there's an accident, the way I look at it, if there's an accident between a bicyclist going slow and a pedestrian, it's not going to be really, you know, dangerous. But if there's an accident between a car and a cyclist, somebody could be fatally hurt, right? So I would like to see us rethink how we move people around, make the trails more connective like they have in Chicago, where they have what's called the Forest Preserve, and you can get from one end of the city to the other going through these forests, having to cross roads every once in a while. But we really need to get a system where we can coexist on sidewalks, bicycles, scooters, and then people can get around much more effectively. Now, in the winter, of course, it becomes a problem, but at least we can walk on those trails and those connectivities.
So, sorry, just to clarify, I think at the beginning you mentioned, so are you in support of bike lanes or are you not in support of bike lanes?
I think that bike lanes on the road are very dangerous. I think we need to move the bike lane, if anything, off the road. So I would lift it up and move, in other words, move the curb over and have the bike lane on a sidewalk next to the sidewalk and the road, because that's safer for everyone concerned, right? Because if a bike gets hit by a car, somebody's going to get seriously injured. If a bicyclist hits a pedestrian, it's not as dangerous, right? Somebody could get hurt, but the likelihood of a fatality is very little. So I think the bike lanes should be off the road. Just move the road over, right? Make the road narrower because the cars don't ride there now, and put them on the sidewalk, as we've done on a dedicated bike lane on, I think it's Leslie. Yeah,
Yes.
On Leslie Street, we have a wide bike lane that goes all the way from Elgin Mills
It goes all the way from Elgin Mills.
down to Major Mackenzie,
No, it goes all the way to Highway 7.
all the way to Highway 7. That's the kind of stuff that we need to do, because my son rides the bike lanes and he knows. So yes, I believe in bike lanes, but not on the road. Get them off the road where it's safer.
All right, so that brings us to our next question, which is a similar topic, but a bit different as we near the end of our interview, which is, of course, urban development, something that is an important part of City Council's responsibility. Right now, the lack of housing is an important problem facing Richmond Hill as our population grows, something you, of course, mentioned earlier. The lack of housing is an important problem facing Richmond Hill, but on the other hand, the density of housing and adequate services are also a concern of many residents. So what is your philosophy of how City Council should approach this problem and balance these two issues?
Okay, so fundamentally speaking, we have to decide as a community where we know that we need more housing. The province has mandated it. The region has spent, I don't know if you know this, but the region has already spent $2.8 billion with a B in advancing infrastructure with the hopes of being ready for intensification. We're talking about roads, sewers, etc. $2.8 billion, hoping that the targets, the growth targets mandated by the province are met. We've fallen woefully behind those targets. That means we're not recovering the money that we've already spent, right? Which could put us in a debt situation and the need for higher taxation. And that doesn't help anybody. That's why it's so important that we now get more intensification into the city. So how do we do that? Again, we, the people, choose. It's our city. So either we intensify along the major transportation routes, or we do a combination of increasing densities along the major transportation routes and infiltrating into the community. Now, Doug Ford has already spoken about allowing, by rights, 4-story buildings on any residential property. Now, if you've heard lately in the media about that one house that sticks out in the neighborhood that they redevelop, well, this would be allowed, worse than that, anywhere. Well, so we have to decide as a community, is that what we want? Like, I live in a residential neighborhood. All the houses are very similar to mine. I wouldn't want a 4-story building going next door to me. I'd rather have the intensification on Yonge Street.
Now, of course, this does bring up a possible dichotomy where we will have very, very large buildings right beside very, very small buildings. Whereas if you balance out the size of these structures, you could maybe have a more, like a bit more spread out, a balanced size of buildings. Is that something you would not support and instead support very strong intensification on Yonge Street?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Sorry, I can word that better. So intensification on Yonge Street would basically create very, very large buildings on one street, which would then be very close to smaller buildings, rather than perhaps spreading it out with more medium-sized buildings, right? So would you be against, I guess, more medium-sized buildings and really prefer to keep very large buildings on Yonge Street?
That's a really good question, because we've done exactly that. For example, there's a property on Bayview. Now, Bayview isn't a major transportation route, but it was in a proper area, out near Snively, I believe. And the general planning principles for the area was a 4-story building. And I think we just approved an 8 or 9-story building, because it was a smaller size building. It wasn't 25 or 35 stories on Yonge Street, but it was in the right location. And it provides a variety of housing options for people. Not everybody wants to live in a little condo on Yonge Street. They might want to live in a little condo surrounded by green space off of Bayview. So those types of things I'm in favor of. Not having all of it on Yonge Street, but the greater majority of the intensification needs to be close to the transportation. And that's why we have those bus lanes, and that's why the subway's coming. Because if you want to make it more affordable and you have it on Yonge Street, again, they can build it more, cost per square foot is much cheaper to build a high-rise unit than it is to build a single detached. And if you don't have all the parking requirements, because people are using their bikes and using their scooters and using public transportation, it becomes even more affordable to be on Yonge Street. And you don't have to go as high because you don't need all that parking requirement.
Thank you for that answer. And this brings us to our to another question. So An important part of the job as mayor would be to represent Richmond Hill at the York Regional Council. How would you navigate the relationship between Richmond Hill and York Region and ensure that Richmond Hill's interests are represented?
Well, that's also, again, a very, very good question. And that was brought up last night at the mayoral debate by the Richmond Hill Board of Trade. And there really is no difference between balancing the interests of Richmond Hill and balancing the interests of the region. Because if you take care of the interests of Richmond Hill, the interests of the region will be served. I'll give you an example. The best example I could give you is when they wanted to build the hub on Yonge Street, where the youth homeless shelter is, and the rest of the building is market share rentals with subsidized housing. Rob Grossi from Georgina begged regional council to have that project built in Georgina because they didn't have one. And the current mayor at the time and the two regional councilors fought to get it in Richmond Hill. And I was one of the people opposed to the location and to the homeless shelter being on Yonge Street for a number of reasons. The biggest reason was that we needed to prepare for what I believed was the eventuality that homeless youth would come there seeking shelter. And then if they were full, where would they go? And nobody had a plan for how they were going to deal with that. And that's why I was opposed to it. And today, if you go into that area, the crime has gone up, violence has gone up, safety is a huge concern around that location because of that. So they wouldn't listen to me back in 2011, 2012. They now know I was right. So now I'm going to have to fix it. And the only way to fix it now is to make sure that we have the resources to deal with the issues. And we discussed that earlier by getting, the kids the help they need and getting them to a shelter to get them in. And if we can't, there's a mental health component, then we need to take action for their own safety. Now, so the interests of the region are the interests of the municipality. We have to fight. If you fight for Richmond Hill, it's good for the region. If you've ever watched the regional council meeting, there's not what they call dysfunction. We still have healthy debate, but at the region, there's never been any violation of any one member of council's rights. The chairman always allows everybody to speak. And sometimes you'll hear, and I love them to death, Mayor Scarpitti and Markham and Mayor Bevilacqua, but they love to talk and talk and talk and hear themselves. And that's fantastic. But yes, they're allowed to speak. They're not cut off and their rights aren't violated. So at the region, it's very different. When Vaughn comes and says, we need permission to put a traffic light at this intersection, but the warrants aren't met. In other words, it doesn't meet, the targets to put one there. We listen. We know that they know what's best for their municipality. So as long as they're fighting for it, we know that there's a good reason. So we listen with open hearts and open minds, and we come to the right conclusion. There's still argument, there's still debate, but it's a healthier environment. And we're going to have the same thing in Richmond Hill when I'm mayor, because I have no intentions, after being a victim of my rights being violated, I have no intentions of stopping anyone from their rights and their responsibilities as an elected official. They can speak as long as they need to speak.
All right. And I think this brings us to our last question. So you've talked a lot about, the ideas that you have for Richmond Hill. So if you were elected as mayor, which one of your ideas would be, the first priority you try and get implemented on council?
So it's going to be the guarantee. It's so important today to make sure that taxes don't go up. Staff have already stated that they want to raise taxes 7 to 10% every year for the next 4 years. If that's true, at 7 to 10%, you're looking at 28 to 40% tax increase. The average house in Richmond Hill probably pays $6,000 a year in property tax. A 40% increase is going to be devastating to a lot of households. I can't allow that to happen. I won't sacrifice services. Just going to have to work really hard, right, to find those efficiencies and have that proper balance. And I believe it's there. We won't have to sacrifice any services, but that's the number one goal. It's easy to just say, raise taxes. It's an easy thing to do. The hard thing is to find those efficiencies, tighten the belt, right? I'm sure you all are starting to learn what it means to work and earn money. And if you haven't done it yourself, you're watching your parents and your grandparents and how they struggled, you know, to earn a dollar and try and keep a dollar and provide for the family. That's the number one thing that I have to work on, because if you don't have money to eat, now we have a serious problem. So that's the number one thing. And plus, I gave a guarantee. So if I don't do it, I have to retire. I have to quit. I don't want to quit. I'm not a quitter.
All right. Thank you so much. That concludes our interview. Thank you for spending your time with us and taking time, to answer our questions.
You're very welcome.